All right, so hello everyone. Welcome to the second session of weekly practice. Today I will be explaining about role fulfillment strategies, extension, and whip in British parliamentary. So what are we going to talk about in today's weekly practice? Today I will be dividing it into two sessions. The first one I will be explaining about extension, from what is extension, what are the types of extension, as well as how can we come up with a good extension in a debate. And in the second part, I will be talking about whip speeches. Um, how do we make a strategic whip speech, and particularly the structure of whip speech. Okay, so without further ado, let's just jump to the first part. Next. Okay, so the first part is extension. Next. So what is extension? So extension is So extension is basically a new material or a new analysis that is brought by a team that aims to support the previous speaker's argument or extending the debate into new areas that has not been discussed in the debate. So extension can come into forms. The first one is by bringing of analysis. So for example, like you bring new benefit or new harms into the debate and explaining why that particular benefit and harms can happen and why is it particularly important in the context of the debate. The second type of extension is not a new argument, but just an added layer of explanation or elaboration of existing argument from the previous speaker. So to put it simply, you use the same assertion that your first speaker or your opening used, but you give different reasoning on proving why it is true, and you add like layers of analysis, for example, in terms of the reasoning, the context or examples that can furtherly strengthen the previous argument. So next, what are the purpose of extension? There are three purposes of extension. The first one is to add new angle of analysis in the debate that has not been explored in the debate. The second purpose of extension is to add more depth to the previous argument. So you use, for example, the same assertion, but you give more depth to that argument by explaining more reasoning, more harms and benefit analysis, new actors characterization, new examples, and basically anything new under the sun that you add to the debate to further enhance the depth of the argument of your previous speaker. And the last purpose of extension is to rebuild or re-strengthen the previous speaker argument. Because most of the time, because we are the latter speaker, there has been like a lot of discussion from before we come to the debate, right? There has been like a lot of rebuttals to your first speaker or your opening argument. So your role as an extension speaker is to ensure that that argument of your first speaker is still relevant in the debate, so that you can prove, like, for example, their response is not enough to our argument, or you can also add more layers of analysis to furtherly strengthen the argument that has been existing to make sure that it's still relevant in the debate. So those are the three general purposes of extension. Next is who gives extension. So in British parliamentary, there are three roles that is required to bring an extension. The first role is the deputies, or basically the second speaker of the opening team. So it can be deputy prime minister, or it can also be deputy leader of opposition. So in British parliamentary, most of the time, the roles of deputies is to add new layer of argument to the existing argument that has been brought by your first speaker. Most of the time, it is strategic for you to just maybe use the same assertion, but you give more explanation to further strengthen those arguments. The reason to this is because BP is quite different from Asian parliamentary. In Asian parliamentary, you have more rooms to insert a new argument that is entirely independent from your first speaker argument. In BP, it is like more strategic for you to like prioritize rebuilding the previous argument over inserting a new argument inside the debate. But this does not mean that you cannot bring any new argument into the debate. Of course, it depends on the context of the debate. So if your opponent, for example, doesn't really give any response towards your first speaker argument, then you have more flexibility to insert a new argument in the debate. So it based on the context. The second roles that give an extension is the members or the first speaker of the closing bench. So, for example, the members of government or the members of opposition. So as a members, you are very required to bring a new analysis into the debate that able to differentiate you from your opening. Because unless you bring any new argument to the debate, you wouldn't be counted as better and you wouldn't win over your opening, right? So it is like heavily required for you to bring an extension. And the last roles that give an extension is the whips, or basically the last speaker of each bench in the debate. So the role of whip is to add new reasoning or examples and strengthening the previous argument. And of course, you cannot bring your argument because you are whip, and it will be unfair if you bring your argument because there will be no one to respond towards that argument. So those are the three roles in the debate that requires you to bring an extension. Next. So if you want to start as an extension speaker, here are two general tips that I will give you to be a better extension speaker. The first tip is a good extension speaker is supposed to be flexible and adaptive to the debate. The reason to this is because there is no fixed template for second speaker. Unlike prime minister's speech, for example, that has like a general template that you should fulfill, like for example, defining the motions or like bringing mechanisms or models into the debate, an extension speaker oftentimes does not have like a fixed template that you can follow. So it completely depends on the condition of the debate. So for example, if in the condition in the debate when your first speaker argument has been heavily rebutted by your opponent, then your priority is supposed to be uh, re-strengthening that argument. But in case when your opponent does not give any response towards your first speaker argument, then you can just easily like say and compare that we are better than our opponent because they don't give any response and this argument still stands. And you have like more rooms for you to add new layers of analysis to strengthen the previous argument or even entering a new argument into the debate to further like the gaps that you have with your opponent team. And the second tips that I will give for an extension speaker is to always try to simplify the debate. So because we are a later speaker in the debate, there has been like a lot of discussion, a lot of spectrum of discussion that has been previously discussed. So our roles is to make the debate clearer on what is actually the main focus of the debate and help the judge see what are like the line of analysis that is or what is the main contention that is most important in the debate. And then later on, you try to strategically position yourself in that debate so you can get like you can build your case um, in the most important areas of that debate. So, for example, in a motion about you know uh, supporting parasocial relationship. So parasocial relationship is basically a relationship between you and your, for example, your K-pop idols or your beloved politicians that is not like reciprocal. So you love them, but they don't love you back. Yeah, those kind of relationship. So if prime minister, for example, or if your opening government has explained about the benefit of parasocial relationship, and your opposition have explained about the harms of that parasocial relationship, I think it will come into a deadlock because the government say that there will be benefit and the opposition say that there will be harms, and there is no team in the house that able to come to like compare which benefit or which harms is actually more likely to occur in the debate. So if you like a letter speaker, you can simplify the debate by saying that actually what matters in this debate is which side can prove which benefit or which harms is more likely to occur than the other, right? So in that way, you can strategically position yourself in the debate to like get higher as opposed to those who just say the benefit of or the harms of that issues. So those are the two tips that I will give for an extension speaker. Next. Okay, so given that I've explained to you what is an extension, what are the purpose of extension, and the general tips, now the question is how to come up with a good extension in the debate. Obviously, there will be like infinite way for you to bring an extension, and there are a lot of rooms to explore. But here are just some several ways of extending a debate that is quite common in the debate. So the first way that you can come up with a good extension is by changing the time. So for example, if your opening or your first speaker brought about the short-term benefit of certain issues, you can brought like for example the long-term benefit of that issue, or vice versa. If your opening explain about the long-term benefit of it, you can also brought the short-term benefit of that issue, and don't forget to explain like why the short-term benefit is more important than the long-term benefit. So maybe for example it is more urgent at this context to prioritize the short-term one over the long-term one, right? And the second ways to come up with extension is by inserting a new actors in the debate. So this can come in a lot of forms, but like commonly, if your opening, for example, has been talking about the benefit of this for small scale actor, like in individual level, you can scale it up and explaining the benefit of that in societal level. But of course, it doesn't always have to be like as broad in a as societal level. It can also means, for example, the benefit of that in family level or in neighborhood level, or basically any other actor that is new in the debate. Um, and one thing to note here, when you want to insert a new actor in the debate, make sure that the actor is actually an important actor in that debate. So don't just directly bring an actor that is not significant in the context of the debate. So if the debate is talking about education policy, whether or not it's beneficial for the student or not, don't just directly say like what is the benefit of that towards the parents, because it will make it like looks very irrelevant unless you can prove like the benefit of that parents is actually important to be talked about in the debate. The second tip that I will give when you want to add new actors in the debate is to make sure that the actor characterization that you brought is specific and has context on it. So for example, in a motion about we want to give loans specifically to women in developing states, for example. Don't just say and characterize the woman as poor people, but also give it more context. So, for example, they are the woman that we want to prioritize is those who are, for example, have to leave their home and have to go to an urban area to find jobs there because probably their husband is abusive, and she has to carry her children and living in a cheap apartment, and like for example living paycheck to paycheck, so they really need they really need loans to keep on surviving. So I think the keynote in here is to make it specific and make it have context, so it will help the judge to see like what are the importance of this um, actor that you defend. And the third way to come up with extension is by inserting new aspects. So it can means a lot of aspects. So for example, you can bring the impact, the economic impact, or the social impact, or the environmental impact, and any other aspects. I think this is pretty self-explanatory, right? And the last one is to give an advanced case study in the debate. So I think most of the time as an extension speaker, we have to like give more portrayal on how does this issues take place, or how does our argument looks like in real life, right? So this is particularly important when we talk about like an actor motions, that we have to prove what are the tendency of this actor, or will they like repeat those action in the future, or like in IR motion when we have to like weigh the interests of certain country, or for example in politics motion when we have to like that to see like the tendency of certain party or any other political figures, right? So I think it is very important for you to give like a historical analysis to prove like why it will repeat in the future. So for example, in a motion about this house will support Twitter on doing an aggressive banning on radical account, um, you can, for example, don't just say that your interest is maybe on maintaining freedom of speech, right? You can also bring an advanced case study by explaining what are the tendency of Twitter on determining how do they ban radical account in the past, right? Maybe you can say that we reject this because the way that social media platform determines which account is radical or not is very arbitrary. Oftentimes, the metric that they use is based on offensiveness, that will make people like really easily claim which one is radical and which one is not, right? Because people in current status quo like is easily offended, right? This happens in the past, for example, on how like we see people who talks about or who tweets about immigration policy will be directly seen as radical, will be directly seen as racist, even though they have like a valid economic argument to back up those claims, right? Uh, this is to prove like why that the Twitter tendency to claim someone is aggressive or not is very arbitrary because it's just based on offensiveness, right? And it's not something that is valid, right? So you have to explain like it will reoccur again in the future, so we will reject this policy. So yeah, that's just the general examples of like how you can explain the tendency of certain actor and how it will repeat again in the future. Okay, next. Okay, so after we give our extension, the next thing that we should do is to prove the importance of that extension, right? Because unless you prove why it's important, then the extension will not be counted in the debate. So there are several ways on how you can make it more impactful. The first one is by explaining that your extension or your side of the house have more likelihood or more probability to exist, right? So regardless of how big the harms or how big the benefit that the opponent team brought in the debate, unless they can prove like why that benefit is likely to occur, uh, it will not be count in the debate, right? So even if you brought like a small scale benefit or small scale harm, if you can prove like it's likely to occur in the future, then you can beat the claims of benefit or harms from your opponent team. So yeah, that's the first way of making it seems more important. The second way is to by explaining the size of impact, because generally if your impact is impacting like more people, then it can means that the your side of the house is more important than your opponent. They just give marginal benefit or harms to only certain individual, right? The third one is by explaining the vulnerability of the actor that you defend. I think this is quite the opposite of the second tip. Uh, you know, uh, for example, even if you defend like a small group of people or certain community or even in the individual level, if you can prove that that individual has more vulnerability, for example, they have less access or they have less alternatives, then it should be prioritized over the actor that has more access or more alternative under their side, right? So even if they define like a really big scale of people, if they are not vulnerable, then they shouldn't be prioritized over this small scale vulnerable actor. So that's the third way. And the last way to make it seems more impactful is by proving that your argumentation is the prerequisites of an ABC outcome. So you prove like you can only have their outcome if you buy our argument, right? So this is going to make your argument looks more important because naturally those the prerequisite is always going to be more important rather than the subsequent, rather than the impact of that, right? So yeah, that's how you like give it more impact on your argument. So yeah, those are the four ways on how you can make your argument more impactful. Next. Okay, so the next part of the session is I will be explaining about strategies as closing, because I do understand that as closing team, most of the time we're very confused on how do we prepare in how do we cast build and what case should we prepare. Um, I think that's a general and common problem that we face as a closing team, right? So I think I have two strategy that maybe can help you to have a better prep time in debate, right? As closing team. The first one is to always try to assume that the opponent is running their argument in best case. What I mean by this is, for example, when you are closing, it is always strategic to assume that your opponent is able to portray your worst case because their base case is your worst case, right? And try to explain how the comparative is better under your side of the house. Okay, so you have to identify what is the threat that you have before you come up to the debate. So threat is basically an argument where if your opponent can prove that argument, you can potentially lose the debate. So for example, in a motion about as environmentalists, we will work closely with corporation rather than opposing it. You can, as an opposition, you can potentially lose if your government, if the government teams is able to explain well about why working closely with corporation will make it more effective, will make our movement more effective to solve the environmental problems. So these are the biggest threat that you have to think of when you are prepping, right? And then you can build your case by considering this threat that you have. So for example, you can build your case in a way that is that can tackle their base case. So for example, you can prepare about, oh, we can see that you will have more effectivity under their side of the house, but maybe you can portray that there will be a lot of harms that exist when you are working closely with corporation, and these harms is like incredibly important and incredibly big that you cannot trade off it just for the sake of effectivity, right? So in that way, you can make their benefit seems less significant. Or the other way is you can try to make their benefit seems inexclusive. So for example, maybe they have the benefit of effectivity under their side of the house, but maybe under our side of the house, we can also get this effectivity by other way, whatever it is, right? But after that, you try to explain that. So we neutralize the benefit of government side of the house about effectivity, but the difference between our side and their side is there will be like a lot of harms under their side of the house. So in that way, you neutralize their benefit and like pushing more harms that will accrue under the side of the house. So in that way, you can seems better than your opponent. So I hope that's understandable. Next. Okay, the second strategy as closing team is to try to track the debate very closely and always try to listen comprehensively. I think it's also a common problem when we are in closing. We still write our case, and sometimes we don't really listen to what's our opening or what is the opening debate talking about, right? So I think it's also important for you to prioritize listening over than just writing the case that you prepare. Because number one, I think the benefit of listening comprehensively is, number one, it can help you to realize which team is your biggest threat in the debate and try to topple them, right? Or in worst case, in case like some team is like very strong and like they give like a really good explanation and proving why their benefit or harms can exist, then maybe you can strategically position yourself to at least not get fourth in the debate. So you can identify which teams is maybe you can beat in the debate, so that you can at least get fourth and not get fourth in the debate. So you can like maybe prioritizing like rebutting the other teams rather than this one team that obviously you cannot beat, right? So I think that's the first benefit, is that you can strategically position yourself and see maybe getting in best case maybe getting second in the debate if you have like a really strong opponent. And the second benefit of this is, I think it makes it easier for you to realize and able to simplify what is the logic gaps of your opponent or your opening team. So you can identify like where their logic is fall short, and what specific part of OG that makes them lose, and you can feel that whole of logic and explaining why you are better, right? So I think sometimes like maybe their case sounds good, but actually there are certain part of logic that they don't explain, and that way as closing team you can feel that and have more contribution in the debate. But you have to note here that in comparing your team with your opening, always try to be as specific as possible on stating what is lacking from your opening team, for example. You have to specifically and explicitly mention what are the lacks of their logic and where their explanation is lacking, instead of just saying that, oh, our opening lose because their case is not comprehensive and there is deadlock in the opening and we solve that deadlock. But instead, I think it's more strategic for you to like state explicitly what is the line of logic that is lacking and what do you do as a closing on like making it to feel that whole of logic, right? So in that way, you can help the adjudicator to understand what is your contribution in the debate. Okay, so for example, uh, in the debate where, for example, uh, there is certain there are certain, for example, in a debate where your opening is explaining about certain benefit and your opponent explain about certain harms, then maybe the logic of their explanation is to explain the likelihood on why that benefit can accrue, right? So in that way, you can differentiate yourself from your opening. Okay, next. Okay, so the next part of this is I will be explaining about whip speech, on what is whip speech and how you can make a good whip speech. Next. Okay, so what are the role of whip speakers? The first role of a whip speaker is to give response to the opponent team, right? Of course, because you are a later speaker, you have to give response to existing argument that maybe, for example, your first speaker has been heavily rebutted, so you also have to give response towards your opponent. The second role of whip is to give more analysis by adding more layers of extension to add the depth of the previous speaker argument. And the last role of whip speakers is to help the adjudicator to weigh the clash in the debate. So if you don't know, clashes are basically groupings of issues where the idea of both teams clash with each other. The goals of having clashes is to simplify or to conclude the various issues that has been presented in the debate so that the adjudicator can easily weigh the winning team. Okay, I hope that's clear. Next. Okay, so after you identify the role and what is clash, the next thing that I will explain is how can you arrange the clash, and how can you divide the clash in a debate. The first way to divide a clash is by dividing it based on the end goal. So you can group the clash by the end goal of the argument. So, for example, in economic motion, usually maybe the debate revolves on several end goals. Maybe the first one is on economic productivity, or maybe the second one is by the end is to reduce inequality. So as a whip, you can divide this. Maybe the first clash is about which teams give more economic productivity, and then you analyze which teams can prove it better, can prove the process better on how they can lead to more economic productivity. Okay, the second way to arrange clash is by principle and practical divide. I think this is quite um, clear already. I think you already know like the difference between principle and practical, and you can just divide it into different clash. The third one is by dividing it based on the actor. So maybe you can divide it. Okay, the first clash is whether or not this is beneficial for an actor A, or whether or not the second clash is whether or not this will be beneficial for actor B. So that's how you divide based on the actor. And the last one is by dividing it based on the BOP, or the burden of proof. So BOP is basically a question that is necessary to be answered to run and prove that your argument is valid, right? So you can differentiate it based on the label of question. So maybe the first clash is which proposal will better improve economic productivity, and the second one is which proposal will be better on protecting workers, right? So that's how you divide it based on the questions. Note in here, when you try to arrange clashes, always try to prioritize the most debated one or the most significant one in the debate over the last debated one. So you make the first clash, uh, the most important discussion in the first clash, and the last one as the second one. Okay, next. Okay, the next part of this presentation is I will be explaining about the structure of whip speech, because I think this is quite confusion, and a lot of people are confused how to make a good whip speech. So these are the general way in which you can structure your whip speech. So the first step is by stating the title of clash. And I have explained before, how do you make the title of the clash, right? And the second step is by rebutting your opponent argument. So identify what is the opponent says in this particular clash, whether their reasoning on proving why certain benefit or harms can happen under their side of the house. And then you try to break it down, right? You in A, for example, you explain what is their first reasoning, and then you rebut the first reasoning by methods of rebuts, like for example by saying A minus, this reasoning is not true, simply like not based on fact, and it's not portraying the reality that exists. And the second way is by proving that it's inexclusive. So you can say that these certain benefits or these certain harms can also exist under outside of the house. And third way to rebut is by bringing even if this particular reasoning is true, we think that it's still better under outside of the house. And then after you rebut the first reasoning, then you jump to the second reasoning. Sorry, it's supposed to be B there. You rebut the second reasoning, and the methods of rebut is exactly the same from the previous one. And then the list goes on until all their strong reasoning are rebutting. Actually, you don't necessarily have to rebut all the reasoning that they have. You just have to choose which reasoning is important and which reasoning is stronger to support their case. Next. So given that you have rebut all the reasoning that support and construct their clash, then the next step is by bringing comparatives. So in comparative, the first thing that you should do is identifying what is your team's argument that support this clash. So maybe you state that the first reasoning that has been brought by my first speaker is this. And then after that, you try to identify what are the opening responses on that reasoning. So for example, if they don't respond to this reasoning, then it's easy. You just have to explain that opponent did not respond to this argument, and this reasoning still stands. Or in case when they rebut it, then your priority is supposed to rebuild like why this reasoning is still true, and why, for example, their response is not enough to tackle the reasoning that we give you. Or you can also give counter argument to ensure that maybe there will be like more harms under their side of the house. So yeah, that's the way like you can give rebuttal on and strengthening your reasoning. And the second one is like you can bring the second reasoning that your first speaker have brought, and the next part will be like following the same structure. You see what is the opening rebuttal on this reasoning, and then you rebut it again if they respond to that reasoning. But remember, as a whip speech, because you are also an extension speaker, you can always add new reasonings to further strengthen the argument. So you're not only like mentioning and strengthening the previous reasoning, but you can also maybe add more reasoning to strengthen the clash particularly, so that it can be more convincing. And remember, adding new reasoning does not mean that you add a new argument, because as long as it falls in the same clash, then it's not a new argument, right? It's still just an added layer of analysis to prove why it is true. And okay, the last part of structure of your whip is even if, by explaining like even in their base case scenario, even in your or even in your worst case scenario, say that there will be like a huge benefit under their side of the house. We think that it's still better under our side of the house because maybe there will be like a lot of harms that will accrue under their side. Even if they have that benefit, then it's not worth it compared to the harms that will accrue. So in that way, you can further like you know make your team seems one step ahead because you already acknowledge that maybe they can run in their best case, but we are still better even in that situation. So I think it's very useful to bring an even if in the debate. Next. Okay, so that the previous slide is like the structure of whip, and it's just the first clash, but you can also like repeat the same structure in the next clash. Okay, the last slide in this presentation is I will be explaining about how you can weigh the importance of arguments or clash in the debate. So as a whip, the way you can prove like why your your argument is better than your opponent is by, for example, number one, our argument has more process or more likelihood. As I've explained before, without the likelihood, all benefits and all harms will be meaningless unless you can prove the process on like why it's more likely to occur. The second way to weigh arguments is by saying that our argument is more important because we protect the more vulnerable actor, as I've explained before. And the third one is by explaining that our argument is more important in these particular context. So the example of this is maybe in the motion about uh, permanent online school for students. Maybe your opponent can say that, oh, we cannot do this because education is very important, and social interaction and direct communication is very important in education for the development of the student. But you can also like portray it like, okay, it's maybe important in the general context, but in this specific context of pandemic, I think social interaction is less prioritized over, like, for example, your health or your survivability, right? So that's how you prove like in this specific context our argument is more important. And the last one is by explaining that our argument has bigger scale of harm, because as I explained, the bigger the harm that you have, the more important it is compared to your opponent. All right, next. Okay, so those are my presentation. Those are my explanation about extension and whip. Sorry for if it's unclear, because I'm trying to like make it as concise as possible. But in case if you have any question, you can drop the question in the link that we will drop later on in the group chat. Thank you everyone for your attention. I wish you a good luck in the future debates. Thank you.